Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to Read650's My Library, True Stories of Books, Nooks, and Furtive Looks. I am Read650 founder and editor Edward Mccann, and today's show is a celebration of National Library Week, which actually begins today, and is presented with support from the New Rochelle Library Foundation, Friends of the New Rochelle Library, and the New Rochelle Council on the Arts, as well as generous donations from the members of our audience. National Library Week acknowledges libraries and librarians and library workers and all that libraries do to build strong communities. As well, you know, and we're right here, the special edition is streaming from the Ossie Davis Theater here in the New Rochelle Public Library, which, you know, this is a remarkable resource, a full-fledged 200-seat theater in a public library. It's just one example of resources that libraries make available to their communities. And I thank everyone here in the house for coming out to support good writing and the spoken word. And I also thank the viewers on the live stream beyond the walls of this theater who are watching. Beyond the viewers here in the tri-state area today, we are joined by viewers in San Francisco, Pasadena, Santa Fe, Denver, and Des Moines, in Chicago, Birmingham, Orlando, Atlanta, Raleigh, Washington, D.C., and Boston. We have one viewer that's on the Appalachian Trail just south of Fontana Dam, North Carolina, in her tent in the rain on the top of a mountain where she gets 3G reception, and she's watching, so hello to Carrie. And we also welcome viewers in Ireland, England, Switzerland, Japan, Australia, and one faithful viewer off Australia's southeast coast in Tasmania, where it's a little after 6 a.m. Monday, and that, as some of you know, would be my cousin Janice, so let's say hello to Jan as well, and the rest of our live stream viewers. I'm so glad that you're all here, as are my partner and executive producer Richard Kolath and our senior editor Stephen Lewis, who's here in the house. On behalf of Richard and Steve and all the supportive folks here in New Rochelle, and on behalf of all the talented writers you'll hear this afternoon, thank you again for joining us to support good writing and the spoken word. I have said this before, but it's one of my favorite quotes, and I think it's really apropos to what we're doing here. Mark Twain said, "I'm sorry to write you such a long letter. I didn't have time to write a short one." And I think most of the writers here would agree about the challenges inherent in writing a cohesive story, a personal narrative in as tight a frame as 650 words. And it really speaks to the technical and creative challenges that really sort of box you in and restrict you. There's no fat, there's no room for anything extra. But when you hear these pieces, you will hear sort of entire worlds and stories that are created within that frame. And it's really a testament to the talent of the writers you hear today. And so let's get to it. We're going to begin Act 1 with Lynn Edelson, who is a special educator and family trainer here in the New York State Early Intervention Program. She's the mother of 2 grown sons, a writer and a musician, and she says she's fairly certain that neither one of them will buy her a beach house. In 2016, she was selected for the New York City cast of the Listen to Your Mother show, and for the past 5 years, she has studied memoir at the Writing Institute at Sarah Lawrence College. Though often accused of writing poetry, Lynn is currently at work on a collection of short stories, and she opens our show today with Enchanted. Please give a warm welcome to Lynn Edelson.
When I was in 3rd grade, I took out a book from the school library 11 times in a row. I'd read it, bring it back, and take it out again. "Are you sure you don't want to try something different today?" Mrs. Incan asked. Mrs. Incan was the elderly librarian who welcomed us into her room each week. She wore her perfect, wavy white hair short, was very tall, and I loved her. "Find a seat, children," she'd say quietly, as we pulled at the heavy chairs surrounding the long wooden tables. And even the boys, who were bustling with excitement, hoping to find books on dinosaurs and space stations, listened to her. We all did. "This is a very special place," she told us the first time we entered. "Each of you will be allowed to take 6 books home, but you have to promise to take very good care of them and return them next week." We nodded solemnly, waiting for the signal to get up and grab the books we wanted before anybody else did. "Again?" she asked me as she went to stamp the manila card that went into the sleeve in the back of the book. "Again," I said firmly. Little Witch was the story of 9-year-old Minx, whose mother was a witch who kept hundreds of jars filled with brightly colored powders on the kitchen shelves. When mixed together, a spell could be cast. Minx longed to go to school, to have friends, and to be like the other children, but her mother forbade it. She was in charge of making the black spell brew that her mother used to change rude children in the neighborhood into the potted flowers that sat on their windowsill. Every night, the witch flew around town on her broomstick, and every day she slept. Minx watered the flower pots carefully, speaking softly to them. At night, when her mother left, she would do her chores, including cooking up toad stew for her mother's morning toast, and then try to find a way to release the enchanted children. There was also a beautiful mute fairy whom she saw fleetingly in her mirror almost every day, gazing at her lovingly. I don't want to give too much away, but let's just say she looked a lot like Minx. Something about the powders on the shelves spoke to me. The colors, the potions that could be created, the magic that was just within reach. Minx experimented at night, pouring them into a large black kettle. She conjured up pixies and centaurs and nightmares, attempting to undo her mother's evil deeds. Minx spoke truth to the adults in town who stood in her way. She convinced the principal that she was entitled to be a student, even if she was the witch's daughter. And every morning, she risked her mother's wrath as she snuck out the door to go to school, despite not knowing how to read, despite having only one filthy dress to wear that she hand-washed herself. The kids at school brought her to tears. "Witch's child!" they screamed as they ran away, except one, an orphaned girl who lived with her 4 brothers and sisters and their great-grandmother in a large, messy house abounding with joy. She gave Minx chocolate chip cookies when she was hungry, defended her to others, and admired what a witch's child knew. She had the courage to be kind and to stand by her friend's side. I loved visiting with these girls day after day. They kept me company as I hid in my room, afraid of my father's temper, as he slammed doors and spoke to no one. I ached for their courage, a large black kettle, and the brightly colored powders that could keep me safe as I felt around Mrs. Incan, as safe as I always felt in the library.
Dorine Taniel is a curator who lives in the Hudson Valley. She has a PhD in art history and has published on 19th and 20th century art in the Gazette des Beaux-Arts, Word and Image, and 19th century art worldwide, as well as a monograph on French surrealist George Malkin. She received Fulbright, Cress, and Chateaubriand scholarships for 2 years of research in Paris, where she discovered pastry products of superior flakiness to their American counterparts, which led to a second career as a pastry chef. Dorine is an avid technical rock climber, and she's logged over 2,000 vertical days on cliffs worldwide. She's taught art history at Wesleyan University and the State University at New Paltz, and she's writing a series of personal essays comparing academia to the restaurant industry. I'm just going to let you think about that for a minute. Her contribution to today's show is an essay entitled Codes. Please say hello to Dorine Taniel.
When I landed in Paris for a 2-year art research stint in 1996, stereotypes of the French as elegantly debauched and a little unhealthy were given substance. Billboards publicized Perrier water with a moist, shiny woman, naked but for a Perrier bottle cap seated on each nipple. Phone sex vendors advertised in taxi stands and subways. Smoking was still chic. Once, after I donated blood, the attending physician invited me for a cigarette in the courtyard. He asked spectacularly vivid questions about my sexual history, while a nurse in a form-fitting white pantsuit smiled and took notes. Everything in France seemed unabashed, loose, free. Everything, that is, except the libraries. While sexually liberated and defiant in the face of lung cancer, the French were pretty tightly wound when it came to call numbers, cataloging, and the hundreds of words for what, in the US, is simply called a book. The archives and libraries of Paris house imprimés and dossiers and folios and manuscrits, all of which are a document, spelled like document in English, but if you pronounce the terminal T, no one understands. Archival research techniques and all this new vocabulary positioned me as the lost foreigner, acquiring archive lingo in what I hoped desperately to convince people was my mother tongue. It is easy enough to search Flaubert in the library catalog and walk away with Madame Bovary under your arm. But finding a postcard Flaubert sent to his sister Caroline while writing Madame Bovary, its existence suggested via a letter from Caroline to her friend Sophie, cited in a biography by a scholar whose patience with the archive far precedes your own, this entails blind rummaging through a morass of scrawl-covered scraps, stored in boxes labeled only with long, hyper-punctuated alphanumeric codes. At first, I dreamily caressed the paper inscribed with quill pens whose tips had likely been sucked by my art historical heroes. But romance soon gave way to despair, as actually knowing in which chaotic scrapbox to start any given search seemed impossible. I applied often to the librarians who, seated high above the reading room, knew there was a magnificent system of order behind France's National Archives and that it must be respected. The acme of order at the National Archives was the catalog room, where insiders and old-timers masterfully unearthed the long codes required to request boxes from storage. The cavernous room was lined with many, many shelves, which supported many more volumes embossed on the spines with numerical series, but no words. You open the books to find lists like this: 3746, painting commissions during the July monarchy. 3747, ladies' fashions, buggies. 3749, the lice epidemic of Calais. It didn't matter that there was no 3748, which would not have cleared things up. Defeated by these inventories of historical odds and ends, convinced I would never actually write my dissertation, I gave up for a month and explored Parisian debauchery instead of doing my research. Even France's famed sensual pleasures, wine, perfume, lingerie, brothels, are systematized by long-winded, ceremonious regulations that provided deep perspective on the alphanumeric codes. Indeed, there was a magnificent system of order behind France's National Archives. I just needed a stronger dose of Frenchness before I was able to understand it. I even learned to like it. But upon my repatriation at JFK, my American bibliophilic romance was instantly refreshed. Soon, I would be walking down the aisles of the Columbia and CUNY libraries, hand in hand with Library of Congress call numbers, and confident in one of the bedrocks of our relationship. The art books, through thick and thin, would always be in the stacks labeled N through NX. This sober, practical, and very un-French approach to classification was native, comforting to me. Yet, I will return to France over and over, at least until I find Flaubert's postcard.
Sandy Sonnenfeld writes fiction, personal essays, and narrative journalism. And with the publication of her memoir, This Is How I Speak, The Diary of a Young Woman, Sandy was named 2002 Celebration Author by the Pacific Northwest Booksellers Association, and her writing has appeared in more than 30 literary magazines and anthologies, including Sojourners, Voices West, and Hayden's Ferry Review. A graduate of Mount Holyoke College, Sandy holds an MFA in fiction writing from the University of Washington, where she won the Lauren D. Millman Writing Scholarship, and she's currently working on a historical novel set in 17th century Russia. Sandy joins us this afternoon to present Willitson Memorial Library, 1985. Please welcome Sandy Sonnenfeld.
During my senior year at Mount Holyoke College, I had a carrel on the north 6th floor stacks of Williston Memorial Library. 6 nights a week, I sat in the hardback chair in Carrel 622 on the west side of the building, working on my senior thesis, a first attempt at a novel. I was 21 years old and desperately longed to be recognized as gifted, hoping that might atone for my myriad human failings, for being, as my mother said to me just before I returned to campus, a difficult child. 6 North only had 5 carrels, far fewer than the 6 other floors that comprised the library tower. I selected this floor less for its isolation than because its stacks housed the library's American literature collection. I believed somehow that my physical proximity to works by writers like Hawthorne, Melville, Poe, Chopin, and Wharton might result in some of their talent rubbing off on me. When I found myself stuck on a paragraph in my manuscript, laboring for the right line of words, I would stand up from my chair, stretch my neck and shoulders, pulling my hands over my head. I would use the nearby restroom, sip from the water fountain. Only then would I walk back into the 6th floor stacks, exploring the long, neatly alphabetized rows of books. By early October, I had made it already to the F's. Skipping Faulkner in his 3-page-long sentences, my eyes fell on a large, red, leather-bound volume with the short stories of F. Scott Fitzgerald embossed in white lettering on the spine. I had loved The Great Gatsby when I read it in high school, but only during one of my creative writing classes had I learned Fitzgerald had published more than 300 short stories. Most appeared in the Saturday Evening Post, the proceeds of which paid the bills while he was busy researching and writing his novels. Now, all of Fitzgerald's stories were compiled in one book. Fitzgerald, heralded as a genius at 24, toasted by Paris and New York's intelligentsia at 26, and who died from alcoholism in relative obscurity at 44. Fitzgerald, who perhaps wrote the most famous closing line of any American novel, just as Melville wrote the most famous opening one. I hugged the book to me, carrying it back to my carrel, knowing I would not be working anymore on my manuscript that night. I cracked open the book. A fusty smell and a handful of dust motes arose from the yellowing paper. It had been abandoned a long time. Now it was mine to explore. As midnight approached, I bookmarked the last Fitzgerald story I had read, placed the volume on the bookshelf that ran across the top of my carrel. I shoved my pen and my unfinished manuscript into my backpack to type up what I had written back at the dorm. I switched off the tiny study lamp. Then, as I did every night, I walked down the 2.5 flights to the main reading room. Built in 1905, modeled after London's Westminster Hall where British Parliament met. The reading room was long, airy, and rectangular, and featured a magnificent hammer beam ceiling composed of wooden arches 60 feet high, joined together with thick oak beams that served as horizontal supports to hold up the walls. Morris chairs, plush settees with oversized cushions, long wooden tables and chairs were scattered throughout the cavernous room, offering students a wide range of seating and studying options. Even at night, light streamed the row of stained glass windows that ran along the top of the room's south side, each one depicting a different seal of a seven-sister college, with Mount Holyoke, of course, the eldest sister, in the middle. As I walked towards the exit, intricately carved angels, wings aloft, poised on the end of each oak beam, smiled upon me.
Sarah Bracy White is a frequent contributor to Read650, and she is a writer, a teacher, and an arts consultant, and a graduate of Morgan State University and the University of Maryland. She's a former inaugural fellow at the Purchase College Writer Center, and her published work includes Primary Lessons, a memoir, The Wanderlust, a South Carolina folktale, and Feelings Brought to Surface, a poetry collection. Her memoir piece, Freedom Summer, was included in 2 Simon & Schuster anthologies, The Children of the Dream and Dreaming in Color, Living in Black and White. Her essays appear in Aunties, 35 Writers Celebrate Their Other Mother, Gardening on a Deeper Level, and Heartscapes, True Stories of Remembered Loves. Other essays have appeared in the New York Times, the Baltimore Afro-American, and the Journal News. She and her husband live in Ossining, and Sarah traveled here today to present Food for Thought. Please join me in welcoming Sarah Bracy White back to the 650 stage. All right.
The only books in the house where I grew up were a big unabridged dictionary, a 28-volume World Book Encyclopedia, and the King James Version of the Bible. The paucity would have been understandable if I'd known that my mother grew up in a house without any books. Her father could read, but her mother was illiterate. Mama seldom spoke about her life as a child. Her focus was on teaching school and sending us to school, even when we were sick. Though she had only 2 years of college training, Mama was a school teacher. Every summer for 14 years, she took classes at Morris College, finally earning her diploma 2 months before my brother, her 5th and last child, was born. To Mama, reading was not for pleasure. Books were a source of knowledge, knowledge that would change your life. For me, books were an escape from a life I could not change. Trapped in a small South Carolina town where the color of my skin barred me from the newly built Carnegie Library on Liberty Street, I reveled in the library on the 2nd floor of Lincoln, the segregated school I attended from grades 7 through 12. My family's tight budget excluded me from the daily hot lunches sold in Lincoln's cafeteria. Each day, after hurriedly eating the bologna sandwich my mother spiced up with hot sauce, I rushed out of the cafeteria and up a short flight of stairs to a place where I could devour as much as I wanted, free of charge. At the top of the stairs, I pushed open the door to a large rectangular room, the mirror image of the cafeteria below, where instead of tables, rows and rows of evenly spaced, honey-colored, waist-high wooden shelves lined with books of all shapes and sizes marched across the room. Sunlight usually flooded the space through windows that covered 3 sides of the room. At the windowless end, behind a low counter made of the same blonde wood as the shelves, sat a middle-aged woman whose round body and sparkly eyes revealed the satiation that comes from many good meals followed by many good books. I wanted a life just like hers. On my first visit to the library, I was overwhelmed by the sight of so many books in one place. I wandered from bookshelf to bookshelf, my neck arched at an awkward angle to read the titles without moving the books from their assigned spaces. The librarian, whom I came to know as Miss Cuthbert, noticed me and called out that it was okay to take books from the shelves. She also said that if I got a library card, I could take up to 6 home each week. I got a library card that very day and thereafter proceeded to spend most of my lunch hour perusing the collection. I devoured the books, the words in those books as greedily as my classmates gobbled cherry cobbler from their stainless steel trays. At the rate you're going, you'll have read every book in the library before you graduate, Miss Cuthbert once told me. That was my plan. Lincoln's library fed my love of words and people when I was too poor to buy books. I lost myself in stories about people whose lives were even more hardscrabble than mine, though some of those lives were far better. Frequently, the bad lives got better. Those were the lives I longed for. Their stories taught me that change was possible. They also taught me that determination and effort were the catalyst for that change. Those stories seeped into my being, assuring me that I would not always be a poor little colored girl living in a separatist world under separatist rules. They also drove me into the arms of learning and became the engine for my journey toward becoming first a librarian and then a writer.
Cindy Clement Carlson has lived in Sandy Hook, Connecticut for 18 years. She was at work in the Sandy Hook School Library Media Center on the day of the December 2012 shooting. All 3 of her children attended Sandy Hook School, and her daughter was present on the day of the shooting. She joins us this afternoon to present The Commitment to Findability. Please give a very warm welcome to Cindy Clement Carlson.
I'm reading The Library Book by Susan Orlean. She describes a library's need for order and proper shelving, observing that the commitment to findability is absolute. A misshelved book may as well be thrown in the trash. School librarians ask their students not to reshelve books that they've browsed for fear that dolphin nonfiction will end up in mythology or panda books will end up in the origami section. After you've listened to gunshots kill 20 kids and 6 teachers, the library can help you get yourself back in order too. After the December 2012 shooting at Sandy Hook School, every book and magazine in the Library Media Center was packed by professional library movers, trucked to a nearby mothballed middle school, and unpacked. Every Kindle, every bookmark, every morning meeting rug was taken from the sacred chaos of that building and brought to a former middle school in nearby Monroe. Over a wretched extended winter break, marked by funerals, our staff of 3 estimated how high could an elementary school student reach on a middle school shelf. We evaluated our storage closet for its capacity to shelter students from gunfire. We unpacked familiar posters and signs, all while learning how to lock the doors quickly. Then, first day in Monroe for the students. Every aspect of their school had changed, yet the library can remind you who you are. Remember how much you liked the stuffed dragon? It's still on top of the nonfiction shelf. Remember the bin of princess books? Yes, here it is. Sharks? Right here in Dewey 597.3. Library cards, brought from Monroe to Sandy Hook, were out on our new circulation desk by the computer as always. You're a third grader, your card is still blue. There's the corner where you picked at the lamination every year since you earned it as a kindergartner. Yes, hearing that metal water bottle clatter to the floor in the hall was upsetting. Let's walk over to the printer so we remember what that sounds like too. Most satisfying was fulfilling a hold that was placed in the old school. With effortful handwriting, young students filled out hold slips to request books that were already checked out. When those books were returned to the new school, I silently thanked the parents who had the presence of mind to remember that it was library day and enthusiastically informed the students that their hold was in. Never mind that the staff was accounting for books left in the classrooms where the shooting had occurred. Never mind that we wrapped a rubber band around a stack of 20 library cards for students that had died. Never mind that we threw away overdue notices for young patrons who had lost a sibling. For our young patrons, we focused on what was consistent and what was still in place. Last night, your mother explained how girls from your Brownie troupe had died. But the next morning in the library, here are the rookie readabouts in the cart as always, square edges lined up in Dewey order. Your bus stop has 2 fewer kids each morning. But in the library, the tent card that shows your place in the table is propped up in January, just like it was in December. That first winter, MLK Day and President's Day came quickly. Tucked in the back room for now were the books that describe their death by shooting. But look, the Valentine's books we've been displaying for years. Come check out Clifford's First Valentine's Day or Fancy Nancy Heart to Heart, just like you did last year. We strove to maintain our traditions, our processes, Caldecott Award Day, Nutmeg Novel Reveal Day. 6 Caldecott days later, we're still putting the pieces of ourselves back together as a school, as a town, as a community. I hope the library helped some of these kids find who they were before the shooting. The commitment to findability was absolute.
Dwight Watson's reading appears in journals including the Chronicle Review, Ars Medica, a journal of medicine, the arts and humanities, Still Point Arts Quarterly, the Dead Mule Society of Southern Literature, and others. The author of The Blacksmith's Book, Eden Creek, a play in 5 monologues, and Dappled Gray. His plays and monologues appear in several books and collections. The recipient of the McLean McTurnan Arnold Excellence in Teaching Award, he's a professor of theater emeritus at La Follette, Distinguished Professor of the Humanities at Wabash College. Please welcome Dwight Watson with It's Story Time.
My granddaughter and I entered the library. We walked through the scanner, past the circulation desk, and the computer lab occupied by city residents searching the web. We are on our way to story time for toddlers. Today's library isn't the library of my youth. Then it was a quiet place with only the sound of rolling carts and the scrape of book covers as the librarian returned books to their proper shelves. Now the library is a command center of activities from ESL classes to Internet 101. My granddaughter tugs my hand. Story time is on the 3rd floor. We begin to climb to the children's library. I'm thinking of gravity. Steps are designed for adults, not short-legged children. Her lift to climb is twice mine, and yet, unfazed by gravity, she powers upwards. We reach the third floor. Story time is crowded with toddlers and grandparents. The storyteller is preparing audio and visual aids. A pleasant woman, she's a seasoned librarian. On another day, I imagine her wearing a gray wool suit, black Oxford shoes, her hair coiled in a bun. But then again, maybe I'm thinking of the librarian of my youth. This librarian is of normal height, weighs more than some, with a smile that doesn't break. Today, she's dressed comfortably in a pair of drawstring pants, an outfit perfect for the physicality of story time. Somewhat short of breath, she executes her lesson plan carefully. To be fair, her story time is engaging. She takes care in explaining the topic to the children, the human body. Look at all the working parts. She wiggles her fingers. She quizzes them on the function of the eyes, ears, and more, and moves them through a series of activities, flashcards, Simon Says, body balancing. We're told to stand up. Then the librarian ends story time with a familiar song. Head, shoulders, knees, and toes. With each mention of anatomy, she points to the body part. One little boy wanders, stepping away from his caregiver. He circles the librarian and in slow motion lifts and lowers his wings, and fades away from the mothership to which he is no longer tethered. The librarian is undisturbed by the boy's independence. My granddaughter seems more attracted to the boy's journey than to the calisthenics offered by the librarian, who presses on. Head, shoulders, knees, and toes. Insisting that the children and caregivers by default join her in song and gesticulation, all, excluding the one spacewalker, do. Head, shoulders, knees, and toes, knees and toes. Unlike my grandchild, who moves easily through the appointment of each body part, I do not bend too well in the middle, and my knees and toes get only a passing acknowledgement, as if I'm saying to them, I see you there. Head, shoulders, knees, and toes, knees and toes. Confidently, I have no problem pointing to the parts that follow, and eyes and ears and mouth and nose. The librarian bends to, in fact, we're all, except for the spacewalker, feeling good about the song as the chorus of kids and grandparents join in joyously, following our grand librarian full voice to the song's conclusion. Head, shoulders, knees, and toes. The librarian bends to express the last repeat, knees and toes. And as she lifts the song to its conclusion, she stands straight up while her pants fall to her knees. To her knees. There is nothing but whiteness. Blinded by bloomers, I avert my eyes, as do others, except for the innocent children who carry on. The librarian reaches down, retrieves her pants, and with a quick tie of the drawstring, finishes the class with, "See you next week." We applaud, file out of story time, leaving our librarian to pick up the pieces. Descending the steps from the third floor presents less of a challenge. Now, we are friends with gravity, friends of the library. Thank you.
This June marks 50 years since the Stonewall riots and the launch of a national movement for gay rights. And Read650 is acknowledging this anniversary with a selection of personal essays on the topic at Stonewall Plus 50, another live storytelling event on Sunday, June 23rd at City Winery in New York City. Tickets go on sale later this month, and the details will appear on our website. We are always working to broaden our submission pool and feature new voices, and right now we're collecting submissions for The Car, which is a broad topic with room for stories about your first or your worst, a road trip or road test, a limo, a lemon, a car wash, the car salesman, the valet, the rental, the accident, whatever sort of comes to mind. Please give this one some thought and encourage the writers you know to consider submitting work. Deadline is July 1 for a show right back here in this very theater as part of the New Rochelle and Pelham Annual Arts Fest weekend. That'll be on Sunday, October 6th. And though we haven't yet settled on a date or venue, we're planning a show called Veterans Voices. And whether you served in combat or never left stateside, we're interested in a literary account of your experience in 650 or fewer words. Deadline is September 1, and again, those details and dates are in your program. You'll also find them under the submissions tab on the website, read650.com. Please follow us on social media, and please share your email address during the reception so that we can stay in touch. And if you're thinking about contributing, I say stop thinking and start writing, because we would love to hear from you. We're going to pause here for a short break of about 20 minutes, but please stay with us because we've got more great storytelling coming up in Act 2. And for our Facebook and YouTube live stream viewers, we have selected 3 audience favorites from our video library, and we hope you enjoy them. So right now, stretch your legs, wet your whistles, and please join us back here in 20 minutes for a great second half. I'm Ed Mccann. This is Read 650. Thank you. We'll return with the second half of Read 650's live show after this brief intermission. While you wait, here are a few favorite performances from our Read 650 archive. We hope you enjoy them, and we hope you'll stay with us.
Raising kids isn't cheap. At first, it's just the basics, like shelter, clothing, and food, but it quickly spirals out of control into music classes, their own seat on an airplane, and many, many pairs of subtly different cleats. The first time I saw the price of 6 weeks of summer camp, I gasped and briefly considered hanging out with them myself. Then there's a point when teens need actual cash. Their social lives no longer happen on the playground. They meet up with their friends at and around places that sell pizza and snacks, and without a few bucks, it's technically considered loitering. They don't need a lot, but it's at this stage that a parent starts to feel like there's a hole in her pocket. Which brings me to my big news. My kid got a job, like for money. I'm trying to let this inevitable but totally unanticipated event sink in. At the most basic level, I'm blown away that he's going to be spending the day doing something that I'm not paying for. It's like he's going to free daycare and coming home with a pocket full of minimum wage. The best part, while he's at this place for free, plus salary, he's going to learn what $20 means. He already knows what it buys: 8 slices of pizza, a trip to the movies, or the price of the basketball he just lost. Frequently, it's just 1 slice of pizza, the change from which gets crumbled into his pocket, only to be found and kept by me on laundry day. Any which way, a 20 goes pretty fast. What he doesn't yet understand is where that $20 comes from. A person with a job quickly learns that a trip to the movie costs nearly 3 hours of work. Specifically, he's going to have to fetch beach chairs and umbrellas in the hot sun for 3 hours in order to go to 1 air-conditioned movie with popcorn. This watershed learning experience, it marks the exact moment when people get a little pickier about the movies they choose. This $20 lesson is one of the many, many things that you can't teach your kids through talking. I tell them about pre-tax dollars and Social Security contributions, and they gave me that look That look I give people when they talk about grandchildren. I get the concept, but how is this ever going to apply to me? Only the experience of gazing at that first paycheck and thinking, wait, that's it? Can teach you what $20 really is. My mom did not have a hole in her pocket, so I got my first summer job at 14. In 1984, we weren't bound by things like working papers or the truth. I walked into a local store and I asked if they were hiring for the summer. When they asked my age, I replied, "How old do I need to be to get this job?" I thought it was a fair enough question. In this way, I worked through high school summers, folding sweaters, then scooping ice cream, and eventually answering phones. And these are all skills that I brought with me into adulthood. It was the office jobs, though, filing stuff, that really made me think about the future. Cooped up under the fluorescent lights, breathing the recirculated air, and watching the clock move backward, I realized that money isn't easy to get. I started to understand how much of someone's life is spent working and the importance of finding a job you enjoy. I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life, but I knew it wasn't putting other people's stuff in alphabetical order. It's ironic how much time and money I spend giving my kids experiences, when the best ones are those they can go out and get themselves. Oh, and the best part, they're going to feed him lunch.
If you walked down the basement stairs of my Aunt Evelyn and Uncle Lot's house and turned right past the tool cave, you'd step into a room of enchantment. Its dimensions were 20 by 30, maybe, and it was windowless. On the wall to the right was a framed question. What baseball score do these pictures illustrate? Below was a triptych depicting 1, a bottle of scotch emptying its final drop, 2, a bare-breasted lady, and 3, a toilet. You lifted up a piece of paper for the answer. Last of the 5th, 2 out, nobody on. 12-year-old me found this clever. Besides, it was the only time I was allowed to look at a pair of naked boobies without my mother pulling me away. I could look at them again and again. I could ponder. At the far end of the room stood a little bar with lots of glasses Uncle Lot called highballs. Above was a photo of Evelyn and I standing on the deck of a cruise ship embarking for Bermuda with all of Evelyn's rich widow friends. Nearby was a glass painting of a waterfall, and if you plugged it in, something behind the glass would turn, and the waterfall would look almost real. There was a button that you were to push if you had any complaints, except it had a little hole in its center, and when you pushed it, a needle came out and stuck you in the finger. Best of all, there were 2 nickel slot machines. My sister and I would ask Uncle Lot for nickels whenever we visited, which as a family was only on Thanksgiving. Ott was bald, fat, and jolly, and would sing "I'm Forever Blowing Bubbles" in a beautiful tenor voice. But Evelyn was distant. Thanksgiving consisted of their grown children, my older cousins, and their grandchildren, and us. I was in between. I had to play with the youngers in the bar while the grown-ups had highballs upstairs and laughed. After turkey, I got into political discussions with my older cousin Joe, who was conservative and made me feel stupid and angry. Once my younger cousin Chris punched me in the stomach. I never fit in. Kind of like the bar. The house was tidy and tasteful, not the bar. It had a painting of 9 dogs standing upright waiting to pee in a fire hydrant. It had a painting of 6 dogs playing poker. It had a little mechanical hobo that if you pushed a button would dance and hold out his hat for a tip, and another with a doctor who would drink from a bottle and then pretend to operate on someone, his nose glowing red behind the surgical mask. When I was in high school, Aunt Evelyn had an operation that removed part of her brain. She was never sure who I was after that, but she was nicer. None of her rich widow friends came to visit. There were no more Thanksgivings. One January, rewiring something under the sink, Ott electrocuted himself. Evelyn went into a nursing home, and whatever mind she had left sailed to Bermuda. The house was turned into apartments and sold. I never visited the bar again. A few years ago, on a trip back to my hometown, I went to pick up a peach pie from a lady who baked them in her home. It was Evelyn and Ott's home. And when I told her who I was, she invited me inside. She and her husband had lovingly restored the house. It was tidy and tasteful. And when I asked her if the bar was still in the basement, she smiled and said, yes, it was. This made me happy. As happy as last of the fifth, 2 out, nobody on. As happy as if I had just had a highball.
Growing up in 1950s Iowa, my sister Beverly, 7 years older, was my de facto mother. It was Beverly who sustained me through childhood tragedies, like my beloved parakeet's death when I was 7. She took the sting out of a grade school bully's cruel words, taught me how to make doll clothes from pastel flannel and satin ribbons while sitting on her big double bed. And when I mastered playing piano, we made music together. I would accompany her strong soprano voice, opera arias, Broadway tunes, church hymns. After she married and moved to Cedar Rapids, I married too, but I didn't stay in Iowa. I moved 1,000 miles away to Philadelphia. Time, careers, petty jealousies, foolish misunderstandings, all of those eventually replaced our harmonies with silence. And I watched from a distance as sips of wine became her solace against the discordance of everyday life. Eventually, Beverly stopped singing, not in a church choir, not in an a cappella group, nothing. And then, dementia. My sister died last year. Beverly was 75. On the subway platform, the B train rolls to a stop at 81st Street. I step into the crowded, hot car. I'm overdressed, can't move my arms to loosen my wool scarf, no earbuds to create a music bubble, no cell service to check hop stop, can't see the transit map, and can't move anyway in this throng of no eye contact, stone-faced New Yorkers. Why this journey? To see a vocal coach of all things. My new shrink, who I sought out in a last-ditch attempt to find out why I'm still so angry with my dear departed sister, said, performing makes you feel heard, connected, so do it. I found Jean through the Open Center catalog. 60-ish, thin as a rail, graceful, articulate, classically trained. She thinks I've got talent, should start auditioning again. Really, Jean? I'm almost 70. For half the lesson, she softens my rigid body using precise Alexander technique cues, her fingertips barely touching my torso, my diaphragm freer with each breath. After a warm-up, I sing Sondheim, or Jerry Herman, or 18th century solos in Italian. Somehow my voice seems clearer, lighter. I'm lighter. For that 1 hour each week, there's nothing in the world but music. something to purge this anger. After the session, I rush out to get the Fulton Street station with only 5 minutes to spare. Above the hum of the morning commute, I hear what sounds like organ or harp music coming from the terminal lobby. I walk up just as a lone violinist begins to play Gounod's Ave Maria. My sister and I love this piece of music, this gem, a masterful combination of much-loved Bach prelude and the soulful melody Gounod added years later. It was always a crowd pleaser when we performed it for family gatherings or local weddings or high mass at St. Joseph's. I lean against a steel pillar in the morning light to listen and remember a summer day when I performed this piece in a clapboard country church. Shutters opened to the surrounding green fields, Beverly's voice perfectly suited for the melody's range, filling every corner. I stay there, transported, slipping on my Ray-Bans to conceal the tears. I'm the sole audience for this pop-up performance. My train comes and goes. I still don't know why I'm so angry with my sister, but I do not walk away. I cannot. Not until the violinist plays the last luxurious B-flat.
December 1970, a small town in Minnesota. The snow's piled high, the temperature's low. Dusk falls early on Main Street. Shoppers bustle in and out of Silverberg's department store, Habbock's haberdashery, Woolworth's, Ben Franklin, and Gordon's Rexall drugs. Rexall, like my grandfather used to sing. I do my shopping at a Rexall store. What they want I got, and furthermore, Jimmy Durante, he prefers it too. We buy Rexall, that's all. How do you do? December 1970. Spirits are high, hearts are light, toes are frozen. Everyone's looking forward to Christmas. Everyone but me. I'm 7 years old, and given the season, I should be ecstatic, but I'm not. I'm worried. I'm deeply worried. I'm going to be replaced. How do I know this? It's very simple. I've been told as much. One day, my Aunt Shirley said, "A new boy is coming to live with us on Christmas." That's all she said. No further explanation was forthcoming. None was needed. I was a good Christian lad, and I didn't question the fact that I must have done something wrong. As Christmas loomed ever nearer, I was consumed by a series of powerful, secret questions. Why was I, the only boy in the house, no longer sufficient? What was my sin? What rule, what law had I inadvertently broken? It had to be inadvertent, for I was a good boy, or I tried to be. Sensitive and shy, afraid of hurting and of getting hurt, there was no harm in me. Or was there? I was treading on dangerous ground. My mother had died in April after a long bout with cancer of the bone marrow. Was I being punished for her death? It was a terrible thought, quickly replaced by one even more terrifying. Was I somehow responsible for her death? Is this why I'm being replaced? It was too much for one mind to hold. I had to put such thoughts aside. I forced them down into the dark place where, months before, I'd placed my mother's death. I could drive away dark thoughts, but I couldn't stop the calendar. Christmas Day arrived, and so did my rival. About 10 in the morning, a car turned onto McMillan Street and rolled up the driveway to the back door of our house. My grandfather and Aunt Shirley left the paper and present-strewn living room to meet our visitor. I waited, sick with tension, sick with worry. Would I like the new boy? Would he like me? Would I get to stay? The porch door opened, and what bounded up the stairs, through the kitchen, nails clattering on the hardwood floor, but an 11-month-old fox terrier. The rest of the day was chaos and noise, running and barking, barking and running, running and running and barking and barking and running and barking and running. And relief. Blessed relief. We had Pete, that's what we named him, Pete, for 10 years. He grew up with me, he became a part of the family. When I was at school, he'd spend the day with Aunt Shirley. Shirley was a retired rodeo girl, a former trick rider and trick roper. The saddle was in the garage, the ropes were coiled and stored in the attic, but she still had the urge to perform, and Pete became her audience. Shirley would sit on the edge of the bed, strum her Sears and Roebuck auto harp, and serenade Pete with cowboy songs. Come along, boys, I'll tell you all a tale, all about my troubles on the old Chisholm Trail. Come a ki-ki yippee, ki-ki yippee, ki-ki yippee, yippee yay, yippee yay. Ki-ki yippee, yippee yay. Shirley never had a better audience. As for me, I remember Pete, the new boy, with fondness. And I often think of something Robert Benchley once said. He said, "A dog teaches a boy fidelity, perseverance, and to turn around 3 times before lying down." Thank you.
We now return to the second half of Read 650's live show.
Thank you. Thank you. Welcome back. Welcome back to our second half. If you're just joining us on Facebook or YouTube, this is Read 650. I'm Ed Mccann, and today's show, My Library, True Stories of Books, Nooks, and Furtive Looks, is a celebration of National Library Week, which begins today and honors libraries, librarians, and library workers all around the country, and everything that libraries do to build strong communities. Before we bring up our next writer, I want to acknowledge a few of the people and organizations who helped make this afternoon possible. First, we thank our hosts, the New Rochelle Public Library, and especially Barbara Davis and Ed Roddy, who make us so welcome and are so helpful with our setup. Thanks too to Lynn Green, Teresa Kump-Leghorn. Today's event is made possible through the financial support of the Friends of the New Rochelle Library, the New Rochelle Library Foundation, and the New Rochelle Council on the Arts, and as they say on PBS, viewers like you. You can support our mission to promote writers with a tax-deductible donation at our website, read650.com/donate. There are also some baskets and things in the lobby during our wine and cheese schmooze following the show. You may also contribute in that way and would make you a patron of the arts and much appreciated. Our show is coming to you live from the Ossie Davis Theater here in the New Rochelle Public Library, where I'm grateful for the talents of our videographers Kevin O'Connor and Sarah Caldwell, audio engineer Jesse Chasen, who makes us sound so good, for our hair and makeup engineer Jessica Rayo, who does the best she can with what she's given. Thank you to the members of our editorial committee who read and review all the submissions, and you know who you are. And a special thanks to our expert copy editor and fact checker, Shelley Kenny. Let's give them all their own round of applause. Thank you. Read 650 is a nonprofit literary organization with a mission to promote writers. And in a publishing environment where it's often challenging to find or to hear new voices, we take our mission very seriously, and we have created a sparkling quality platform for true personal stories told 5 minutes and 650 words at a time. And Read 650 events they're not open mic shows. There's nothing random or improvisational about what we do, and we place a strong emphasis on the craft of writing. And the submissions featured on our stage were selected and vetted by an editorial committee of essayists, novelists, memoirists, journalists, and playwrights. And that's a whole lot of sibilants, playwrights, sibilants. And that's all before they make it to Shelley, our copy editor. In addition to our live events and social media and robust website and YouTube channel, one of the ways that we promote writers is by making essays from the shows available in these anthologies, which are printed collections of the stories that you hear on our stages here and in New York City and in the Hudson Valley and throughout Westchester County. Here we have What We Ate, True Stories of Love, Loss, and Lupini Beans. It's a favorite. Straight out of Ireland from last week at City Winery. This was our Carnegie Hall sponsored event, presented event. That's a wonderful one. And we also have the collection of the pieces that you're hearing today available. These will all be available at the reception after the show. They sell on Amazon for $10 each, but today only, 3 for $20. Now, is that a deal or what? And I'm going to tell you, they're beautifully designed. They look great on your nightstand or your Airbnb rental. Much, much nicer than that messy stack of New Yorkers on the nightstand that you keep meaning to get to. And they're just 2 pages, so they're a great bedtime story. So, so know that those are available, and those 2 help support the mission, and we thank you. I guess, you know, why don't we just go back to our show? That's a whole lot of that. How about Andy Rosenthal next? She is the author of the novel The Bookseller's Sonnets, which was a Hadassah Brandeis Institute Book Club selection and a National Jewish Book Council Book of Note. Andy has published personal essays in Kveller, Scary Mommy, and Reform Judaism magazine. And for 5 years, Andy was the writer of a first-person column featured on interfaithfamily.com and in the Westchester Jewish Chronicle. Most recently, she published a selection of poetry in the Westchester Review. And in her professional life, Andy serves as a community mobilizer for the UJA Federation of New York, and she's also an accomplished musician. She lives here in New Rochelle and made the short trip here to the Ossie Davis Theater to present A Page Out of Time Life. Please say hello to Andy Rosenthal.
While most of my friends preferred Carvel or Old Eli's candy store at the corner of Mill Road and Parsons Place, my hangout was the Eastchester Library. Built in 1967 at the height of the space race, it had a futuristic look to it, a sleek white monument to the incurably curious. Our town's very first instance of mid-century modern architecture crowned the hill on Oak Ridge Place, its bright lines a sharp contrast to the sun-mellowed, friendly red brick apartment houses next door. Inside, a glassed-in stairway led to the main floor, its ceilings dotted with dancing Calder-style mobiles. The reading rooms, with their book-lined aisles and twin silvery staircases to the top floor stacks, seemed to beckon to the very heavens. My library was a refuge, a respite from the vagaries of childhood fads and fashions. It was safe. Certainly, no self-respecting school bully would be caught dead there. More importantly, it was filled with books, those gifts of words destined to ignite the imagination of an aspiring author or soothe the hurt feelings of a 7th grade outcast. Almost from the moment that I received my first library card, I craved the tranquility of a life surrounded by stories. In 1985, my 15th summer, I was hired as a page. My haven now became my workplace. For a geeky, bespectacled teenager fascinated with history, the 80s were intolerable. An era of bad cologne, 3-minute music videos, and way too many cable channels. History was starting to feel vaguely disposable. 1985, in general, was an environment hostile to the bookish. I needed an escape. And that was when I discovered a secret portal to the past. In the library's basement, next to the service elevator, was a door no one ever opened. One morning, intrigued, I abandoned my cart of returned books and quietly entered. I breathed in the smell of dust and old ink, and as my eyesight adjusted to the low light, I saw boxes upon boxes of files on the steel shelves. Reaching inside of one, I pulled out a magazine called Look. Its cover seemed to call out to me from the 60s. A girl in an orange mini dress, white go-go boots, elaborately curled hair, pale lipstick, and a tracing of flower petals surrounding her wide, dark eyes. I discovered defunct magazines I had never heard of, titles long out of print. Of course, there were familiar issues like Vogue and 17 and Cosmopolitan, but I had no interest in those old, dusty, fluffy stories about prom dresses and boyfriends. Instead, I read about war and culture and music and politics, a cascade of a turbulent decade or two unfolding in real time. As the summer days passed, I would find time each day to slip down to the basement. I read not only about the Kennedy assassinations and the Beatles' arrival in America, but also the less monumental stories that were published on my parents' birthdays, the week of their wedding, the day I was born. I wanted to read the headlines that had once perhaps captured the attention of those I loved from a distant newsstand in the past. Even though I knew how so many of these stories ended, I wanted to read them in their time, with their eyes. Reading Life and Look and Harper's Bazaar and Time gave me access to history while in its present day, captured in those thin, fragile pages. They allowed me to hold the past in my hands, helped me to understand the days of those I loved when they were my age, young and wondering and discovering their lives. That magazine room, it no longer exists. A year ago, I stood in that space, now an auditorium, giving a book talk as a writer of historical fiction whose work is rooted in uncovering the details of the past. But once upon a time, I found out what it was like to touch the past before it was scanned, saved to the cloud, digitized, discarded, intangible.
Thank you. A graduate of Brown University, Jeffrey Podolsky has worked as a reporter and editor at People magazine, George magazine, Tatler magazine in London, as well as the Sunday Times magazine of London. He was a founding editor of WSJ magazine. He's written about men's style at Barron's, and he's appeared as a commentator on WSJ.com. A frequent contributor to W magazine, Vanity Fair, and T, the New York Times style magazine, Jeffrey enjoys nothing more than reading aloud to his two incorrigible mutts, Alibi and her pup, Junior. But now, for an audience of humans, Jeffrey will read Studying My Father. Please welcome to the Read 650 stage, Jeffrey Podolsky.
My father's library furnished me with a zest for the written word, culminating in a close connection to libraries and him. He was a foreboding figure, never more so than while sequestered in his library in my childhood home in Detroit. No one dared knock on that stained glass door. We could feel his presence, but not much else. He could sense the slightest step. Not that I ever heard him raise his voice. His mere presence unraveled you. For reasons I've yet to fully understand, my father granted me access to his sanctum, a place I would later learn he needed to go for clarity absent in his life with my mother. She was often lost. She was often lost in alcoholic fog of illness. I spent endless nights with the toy car on an Aubusson rug. He left me alone with my imagination. I was a captive audience, a 5-year-old in a body cast, the result of a freak fall. You know, it was a lucky break. In some ironic way, I loved staying up past midnight with my insomniac father. The comfort of wood-paneled walls, displaying the Oxford English Dictionary, Grove Musical Dictionary, both the Old and New Testaments, and his personal Bible on wine by Frank Schoonemaker. Epic poetry by Chaucer and Homer sat opposite the latest paperbacks by Irwin Shaw, Philip Roth, and John Updike. Come midnight, he abandoned his dictaphone and partner's desk for a leather wing chair and a book, scrawling questions and comments on each page. He sniffed and sipped a rounded belly glass of XO Armagnac while reading to the sonorous and heart-rending rhythms of T.S. Eliot or Billie Holiday. I lay blanketed below in a billow of smoke from his endless rotation of Churchillian cigars and various shaped pipes. By the time I was 13, I'd become an outcast. The odd kid out at a boarding school where I spent most of my first term hanging by my boxers on a nail. I found refuge from the great wedgie at the Choate Library, a Georgian structure built by Andrew Carnegie. Its blue-blooded warmth of fireplaces, chintz-covered chairs, and works by John Dos Passos, alumni like Edward Albee, Adlai Stevenson, and John F. Kennedy, felt like something my father might take to, and it eased for me a wrenching homesickness. At college, a different alienation set in, an isolation personified by the cold exterior of the Brown University Library, aptly named The Rock. Each night, its interior became the campus social hub, where students were acutely aware of their hallowed status and carried themselves accordingly with a cool self-possession. Inside and out, the library, the one place I could always find solace, now terrified me. It took another library, though, for me to realize my professional calling. While flipping through Time magazine in Boston's neoclassical Athenaeum, soon after I'd graduated, I realized my desire to become a newspaper reporter, an epiphany so emphatic that I heard a stereophonic shh while I stood up and announced to all around me that I would become the next editor of Time magazine. I settled for a less lofty role at People magazine, where I became resident expert on royal bulimia. But well at the Time life building, I underwent a life-defining circumstance, a trip to the morgue, that mythical yet real repository of clips about everyone from Fatty Warbucks to Edward Teller. Information on a scale I'd never seen before. So entranced have I remained by my father's reading habits, his embrace of words and their meaning, that today, when I look out of my window at my neighborhood public library, the Jefferson Market branch in the West Village, and hear the tonal chimes from its medieval clock tower, I see my father glancing down at his pocket watch. The library nook I've created in my apartment can't rival that of my father's, but I do imagine him taking his place in one of the chairs I have there and are talking together, two adults, about the words surrounding us.
Barbara Josselson is a freelance writer and author of the novel The Last Dreamer. Her articles and essays appear in the New York Times, Parents Magazine, American Baby Magazine, Writer's Digest, and Westchester Magazine. Online, you can see her work at workingmother.com, grownandflown.com, nextavenue.org, and elsewhere. Last October, she appeared alongside 8 other writers in Every Family's Got One, a staged reading at the Cinema Arts Center in Huntington. And Barbara teaches novel writing at the Sarah Lawrence College Writing Institute and other venues, and she's here to share a memory of an early library experience with Nancy Drew and the mystery of the missing books. Please say hello to Barbara Josselson.
It was a decision worthy of Solomon, but it landed on my 12-year-old lap. Should I fail English, or should I throw Mrs. Flukiger under the bus? Mrs. Flukiger was the children's librarian at Syosset Library and the most magical adult I'd ever encountered. She wore white blouses with Peter Pan collars and flouncy skirts and had straight black hair that hugged her head like a bowl. She looked like she never completely grew up. I figured a life among kids' books could have that effect. But the most wondrous thing about Mrs. Flukiger was her recommendations. She knew exactly what each kid would want to read. The books she selected for me always revolved around a quiet, well-behaved schoolgirl who asserted her independence to rescue someone in need. It was the kind of heroine I longed to be. That spring, my English class studied journalism. Our teacher, Mr. Feinstein, thought investigative reporters were the noblest of people, and he urged us to pursue truth at any cost. Our final project was to interview someone we admired. Of course, I chose Mrs. Flukiger. Also around this time, my mother began working as a library assistant. One evening, I overheard her tell my dad about a tiff at work. A patron had asked Mrs. Flukiger for the Nancy Drew section, and Mrs. Flukiger had said there wasn't any. "Those books are junk," she told the woman. "I don't carry junk." My mom sounded amused by the incident, but it stopped me cold. I'd read some Nancy Drews we owned at home, and they were very nice books. Nancy was smart and determined, as in The Hidden Staircase, where she stumbled through a trapdoor, landed in the pitch-black cellar, squeezed through a narrow passageway, and armed only with a flashlight, discovered the secret staircase that revealed the burglar who had terrorized the 2 elderly widows. Why was that junk? And more important, why was Mrs. Flukiger banning books anyway? Mr. Feinstein would tell me to call her out. But no, I thought, Mrs. Flukiger was someone I loved. Could I actually accuse her of censorship and make her look bad? On the other hand, could I brush this off? Would Woodward and Bernstein let her off the hook? What was I going to do? Still unsure, I arrived at her office on interview day and started down my list of questions. Where did she grow up? Brooklyn, she answered. Why did she become a children's librarian? She was passionate about reading. How did she choose which books to carry, and were there any she wouldn't? I held my breath, hoping I'd misunderstood my mother. No such luck. I don't carry junk, she said, like Nancy Drew. That's junk. A slew of follow-up questions aligned in my mind like well-trained soldiers. What made those books junk? What criteria did she use? What if kids wanted them anyway? Was censorship ever okay? I opened my mouth and tried, but it wasn't happening. I didn't have the stomach to put Mrs. Flukiger on the spot. I simply wrote, "No junk," in my notebook. Then I asked another question. 2 days later, I submitted my paper, and when Mr. Feinstein returned it, he jabbed his finger at that word, junk. "Why didn't you press her?" he said. "You missed the whole story." I nodded and looked for the F. He had been kind, B-, but it was the lowest grade I ever received. I never showed Mrs. Flukiger my paper. I didn't want to explain that grade. But even so, I regarded it as a badge of honor. Like Nancy, I had descended into the darkness and emerged intact, if slightly bruised. I'd sacrificed my grade and withstood a teacher's disapproval, all to protect the reputation of my beloved librarian. Finally, I'd acted like the heroine in a novel, a so-called junky one, but a novel nevertheless. I had Mrs. Flukiger to thank for that.
David Mazzello began his literary career as a nonfiction book editor at Simon & Schuster and held senior editorial positions at many magazines, including Travel and Leisure, Art and Antiques, and Town and Country, where he was features editor. He's currently executive editor of Milieu, a magazine about design and architecture. David's a widely published essayist and poet, with pieces appearing in the New York Times, Salon, Best American Essays, and numerous literary and art magazines. His plays have been produced and performed by the Manhattan Repertory Theater, Jewish Women's Theater, Big Apple Theater Festival, and Fresh Fruit Festival. The author of 2 books about art and architecture and a frequent contributor to Read 650, David returns to our stage today to present Scale and Effect. Please welcome David Mazzello.
Just a morning later, and I couldn't remember if the house was hexagonal or octagonal. The frame dwelling occupies a crossroads, so quiet there's no stop sign. And it drew us across the campus from the library like a lodestone, as if the glinting materials in the schist of its border walls possessed magnetic charge. My friend and I felt a sudden love for its shape and scale. I could live there, I said to him, as did he, but with a different tone. We circled the house, petted the warped planks, tried the door, locked, and inhaled the scent of clipped hedges, wringing it like a trimmed beard. We'd seen the house through the campus library windows, a brutalist edifice, no aesthetic relation cousin to the dwelling. We were there to disassemble an exhibition my friend had mounted in the library. He's an expert in monumental sculpture, forms mostly abstract, positioned on office building plazas, anchored in fields and sculpture parks. Some loom heroically, others register as mere shadows. Because he's a book designer by profession, whose favored shapes are serifs and Arials, he had arrayed in glass display cases in the undergraduate library vintage pamphlets and brochures, photos and sketches, letters related to the making of monumental sculpture. The publications dated from the 1960s, when most of the works were fabricated and assumed roles as public art. My friend wanted me to see his show before disassembling it and carrying the materials back to New York by train from the upstate campus. After I had examined with exaggerated enthusiasm the printed matter, backdropped by maroon velvet, not a single student stopping to look, he unlocked the cases and we began the gathering. He had asked me to spend the Saturday with him, someone whose presence had become as big to me as sculpture, but to whom I could not confess such without monumental effect. No book in the library told the lesson I now knew about falling in love, requited or unrequited. You learn to love what the other person loves. Suddenly, I noticed monumental sculpture I encounter, a Calder stable whose red, yellow, blue fins stab a lawn, a glossy yellow beam drawn across a green meadow in an upstate park, the black cube at Astor Place to which I give a push and watch it whirl. As he and I gathered the brittle ephemera documenting works that endure, I realized scale has no relation to effect. Here was an exhibition in a library about monumental things recounted in diminutive ways. Here was a man unaware of the scale of my feelings. I'd read that every cell within us has 6 feet of DNA. Strands, if laid out, would reach 67 billion miles. Each of us has something in us that distancing. I held the hinged glass cases as he scooped up materials, the panes capturing our intersecting reflections and refractions. If I could sculpt, cast a monumental work on the scale of those recounted in the publications, this collaboration between us is what I would render. Absent such talents, that scene remains preserved inside of me, on permanent exhibit only to myself. He was sad his show was over, aware too that its effect on the students hadn't exactly been monumental. So when we exited the library, we found ourselves drawn to that historic house, lingering. We instructed the cab to come there to take us to the station. We each looked at the house with different longings. I imagined the unfamiliar and likely lovely dimensions within that I wished I could occupy with him. Eventually, my friend became too monumental to me, so much so it overwhelmed our friendship. But that day, in the back seat of the cab, I suggested he come to my place for dinner, and that during the train ride back, we would finish the Sunday crossword puzzle, solve it together, side by side, filling in the grid, then reassemble the library show where I live.
Christia Basil has been a producer in the film and TV industry since 2005, and in 2015 she co-founded the company Popple. Say it again. Popple Preparation is everything. Popple Waka Productions, through which she develops scripts and show concepts. And she was inspired to write for children after having two of her own. And her first children's picture book will be released this fall. Originally from Chennai, India, she has been trying to figure out being a New Yorker for the last 15 years. Please give a warm welcome to Christia Basil and my library.
If I could, I would live in a cocoon of books stacked 10 high, 20 deep. If I could, I would choose to die amongst books, words swirling around my soul, skeptical of another heaven. All my life, libraries in all forms have been my true church, reading my true religion. This love of reading is my mother's living legacy to me. Newly married and settling down in the sprawling metropolis of Madras, the first thing her husband discovered was that he had committed to a library visit once a week. These were libraries where you paid a small fee per book per day. This expense would find a permanent place in the monthly budget. But riding his scooter to the library with his young wife primly sitting pillion, impeccably dressed in a chiffon sari, her arm wrapped across his hammering, happy heart, the effort and the expense had been worth it. 3 kids later, the tradition continued. Day 1 of summer, my father knew to prepare for the hour-long journey to the biggest and best lending library in the city. We now had a family van, our trusted Maruti Suzuki. We carried with us 2 large jute bags with sturdy wooden handles. They would come back filled to the brim with novels for my mother, Daniel Steele and Mary Higgins Clark, jostling with Stephen King and John Grisham. For us kids, it was Archie and the Gang, Spunky Nancy Drew, and those groovy Hardy Boys. But it wasn't just the lending libraries of Madras that fed my reading frenzy. In the seaside town of Pondicherry, my cousins maintained a small library in their home, stacked with back issues of Reader's Digest, as well as books on the adventures of adolescent girls in boarding schools like St. Clair's, Mallory Towers, and the Alpine Chalet School. Oh, how I longed to be a boarder sharing tuck boxes during covert midnight feasts. When we visited the cosmopolitan city of Bangalore, my other cousins introduced me to Trixie Belden. Trixie solved mysteries around her hometown, Sleepyside-on-Hudson. Trixie was klutzy and awkward, but smart and fearless. I related to her growing up. I still want to be her when I'm all grown up. And this series is absolutely why I chose to live in the Hudson, near the Hudson. I came to the United States for my master's degree at Miami University in the bucolic town of Oxford, Ohio. My first winter knocked me near dead. As undergrads stocked up for snowstorms with giant bags of pretzels and six-packs of beer, I showed up my spirit by heading to the cavernous school library and checking out armloads of books on every subject that had ever caught my imagination growing up. In my cozy off-campus room, I set up a third-hand bookshelf that I lovingly lined with my library books. I racked up substantial fines I had to pay before I could graduate, but it's a small price for 2 years of literary immersion. To date, my most delightful discovery about the US is not the jalapeno poppers from Arby's or the lemon glazed donuts at Krispy Kreme. It is the very fact that public libraries exist. To be part of a community that prioritizes access to books the same as access to water, I do not take this for granted, especially now. My parents taught me well, and I'm trying to do the same for my children. It is now my treasured tradition to visit the local library with my kids. After story time, I read in a rocking chair while they lose themselves in the children's nook. We leave with far too many books to carry. Thank you. It's also my pleasure to introduce our next reader, Ed. Edward Mccann is an award-winning writer, producer, and the founder and editor of Read650, today's event. It's a literary forum that celebrates the spoken word with live events in New York City and elsewhere. A frequent contributor to Milieu magazine, Ed's features and essays have been published in literary journals and anthologies, as well as national magazines, including The Sun, Country Living, The Irish Echo, Better Homes and Gardens, Good Housekeeping, and others. His essay, Pregnant Again, was selected for the anthology Listen to Your Mother, published by Putnam. He lives and writes in the Hudson River Valley and closes today's show with the Bookmobile. Please welcome Ed Mccann.
Thank you. I grew up the youngest of a large family in a small town that just happens to be located in a big city. During the early 70s, my southern Queens hometown of Broad Channel, the only inhabited island in Jamaica Bay, was a provincial backwater sharing more in common with a Newfoundland fishing village than anything in New York City. During my childhood, kids made their own fun on boardwalks and unpaved roads, playing ring-a-levio or smacking a handball off the side of Hildebrand's funeral parlor on East 14th Road. Our soundtrack was the cry of seagulls and the roar of jets taking off from nearby JFK International Airport. With its distant skyline visible to the west across the bay, Manhattan was as remote to me as the city of Oz. And while Broad Channel had plenty of otherworldly charm in its sandbars and horseshoe crabs, attracting nature lovers and hardcore bird watchers to its wildlife sanctuary. During my childhood, the town had no movie theater, no public park, no youth center, and no library. We had things to read at home, of course, The Jungle Book, Swiss Family Robinson, The Reader's Digest, but not much to hold the interest of a little kid for very long. I was 6 years old in 1970, a first grader in Mrs. Wortman's class at PS 47. With help from Mom and my sister Mary, I'd learned early to read and to write, so I was already bored and disruptive while some of my classmates were still learning to sound out words on the page. I needed more to do. I needed more to read. One day, something magical happened that altered the course of my childhood. Mrs. Wortman took our class on a local walking field trip, traveling the short distance to Cross Bay Boulevard, where a sleek, gleaming bookmobile sat parked in front of O'Sullivan's Pharmacy. Excited and anxious, I climbed the fold-out steps at the vehicle's rear, passing through a portal into another realm, a remarkable carpeted and air-conditioned library on wheels. I scanned the walls of shelves lining the interior, inhaling the scent of all of those books. An expansive wraparound windshield allowed daylight to flood the cabin of this amazing, tricked-out rolling library, a kind of miracle that seemed to have come to town from the future. Its driver was also the librarian, and she swiveled her seat to face us at the narrow checkout desk, where she issued me my very first, very own library card, which I used to check out an armload of bright yellow Curious George titles. What a thrill it was to carry those books back to school and then be allowed to take them home, my library books from my library. I read and reread them and traded them the next time for more books from a seemingly limitless, bottomless source, one of the most indelible joys of my young life. Having my very first, very own library card meant it was also time for me to have my very first, very own wallet, a light-colored billfold with lacing around its edges that featured an embossed cowboy on a rearing horse. I felt very grown up every time I reached for my wallet to present my VIP library card at the bookmobile checkout. There were dozens of branches of the Queens Public Library, but until age 12 and 6th grade, I never went to any of them. I went instead, in all seasons and in all weather, to the bookmobile. As years passed, I moved on from Curious George and Dr. Seuss to Charlotte's Web and the Hardy Boys, entering stories and dimensions that expanded my imagination and whetted my appetite for more. The immediate surroundings of my island hometown may have had its limits, but the entire world opened up to me in the bookmobile, my once-a-week miracle library on wheels. Thank you again so much for joining us today, and please don't rush off, because while we wrap things up, you can enjoy some additional refreshments, and you can sip and nibble as you schmooze with the writers and each other and talk about reading and writing and libraries and these incredibly well-priced, beautiful books that we have available at the reception, and you'll want to check those out. Within the next week, the individual videos of today's readings will be available, along with hundreds of others on our YouTube channel. Please visit and subscribe. Please explore our website and join our emailing list by sharing your contact information on the clipboard. As Dan Zevin said at our very first show, you can hate us in real life, but please like our Facebook page. Just so that'll be fine. And finally, if you enjoyed what you heard here today, please consider supporting our mission to promote writers and quality spoken word events with a tax-deductible donation. All of us really appreciate you being here to share in spoken word and help spread the word about the spoken word. And we're going to do something now that we rehearsed a little earlier before you got here so we wouldn't be embarrassed. So we're going to tie it back. Hold on.